Hello and welcome to Chasing Leviathan. I'm your host, PJ Weary, and I'm here today with Dr. Adrie Kusserow, the author of The Trauma Mantras, which we'll be talking about today. She is also the department chair and a professor of sociology and anthropology at St. Michael's College. This is a memoir in prose poems. Dr. Kusserow, wonderful to have you on today.
Thank you very much. I'm very happy to be here. Thank you. Mm-hmm.
So, Dr. Kusserow, why write the trauma mantras? Why write about trauma, and why write about it in prose poems?
Let's see. So I am a cultural anthropologist. I went to Harvard for grad school, and I only mention that because I had a department that was primarily male British social anthropologists. And I used to skitter off and take poetry classes in the yard, and basically was a closeted poet during my time that I was getting my PhD. And this was never approved of. And never would have been approved as part of my dissertation in writing up my fieldwork. At that point in anthropology, creative writing was seen as separate, and you were supposed to, I think, try and align yourself with this supposedly a completely objective scientific vantage point. And the assumption was that poetry kind of muddled that up. At any rate, I felt like I was starving at the time for more subtle, nuanced, poetic descriptions of the tremendously vibrant and rich cultures that I was reading about and that I was hoping to explore. I found academic writing stiff and, to use one of my favorite words, cachectic. I just felt it wasn't doing justice to the true complexity of humans. And so poetry, for me, insofar as it involves metaphor and simile and rhythm and line breaks and image and description, it has a way of bringing people to life, in a sense, in a way that I was found missing in academic writing. So it's also just comes much more naturally to me. So from there, I've published one ethnography, which is not poetic at all. But after that, I've since published 3 books of what I refer to as ethnographic poetry, which is, I can give you the formal definition here. It's qualitative research using self-reflection and writing to explore personal experience and connect this autobiographical story to wider cultural and social meanings and understandings. So that's actually a definition in the first part of my book of what's called autoethnography, which just means you are connecting your own personal experience to wider patterns of cultural processes and meanings. So I'm not interested in confessional poetry unless it's linked to the ways in which culture has shaped me, I guess. So I guess that's kind of why it's very much a hybrid book. The Trauma Mantras is it's a hybrid book. It's prose poetry, it's memoir, and it's anthropology all mixed into one. And I do I guess I do believe that anthropologists have sort of an ethical responsibility to write well and to write in ways that grip people, and bring them in and engage them and not alienate them with academic language that is, maybe 20 people can understand. I believe this, I write about I write about suffering, and I write about some pretty tough stuff and inequalities, etc. And I feel like the language needs to live up to that experience, and in the process, bring people in to be moved. I'm interested in anthropology that breaks your heart. As Ruth Bahar, an anthropologist, who was one of the first people that basically started talking about the importance of writing in a way that engages people's emotions as well in anthropology. So I'm very much, I want to move people. And I do believe that sort of the tentacles of poetry can pull people in a way that is very powerful. So I guess that, yeah.
That's a great answer. Yeah, no, I love it. The first question may seem like a silly one, but I have to know, how do you spell cachectic and what does it mean?
Oh, okay. I like words that sound fascinating, and it's a little embarrassing here. Okay, I think it's CACHECTIC, and it.
Do you use it in the book?
I think I use it once. I probably couldn't help but use it. Yeah.
Oh, you must have, because I spelled it right when I wrote it down here, and that must have stuck in my brain. Yeah. Oh, okay.
I think cachectic means without much flesh, sort of sickly, anemic. That's my sense of the meaning of the word. Somewhat sickly, anemic, unhealthy, way too skinny, kind of. Yeah.
Emaciated.
Yes. Yeah. That's just how a lot of academic writing felt to me. It felt like there wasn't enough flesh hanging off of it. The flesh.
You're not the only one.
The flesh of human emotions and nuance and rhythm and tone and all sorts of important elements of what it means to be human. So.
Let me ask this other question first, but I'd love to come back to this. Why do you want to move people? What's at the end of that goal?
That's a great question. 2 reasons. Why do I want to move people? Because I want them to perhaps take action to either get involved with suffering people or help suffering people, or question social inequalities themselves. And then a very selfish reason, I want to move people because I want people to be with me where I'm at. I've always felt like an outsider in my own culture, a very much kind of always felt I was a bit odd and strange, and that perhaps helped my ability to stand outside and observe cultures. But if I move people, it's a lovely feeling of having them perhaps be in the same emotional place that I am in. So maybe that's kind of the selfish version of it. Mostly, I've been obsessed with inequality my whole life and why it's tolerated, how people can tolerate it, how people legitimate it. And I want to move people in the hopes that they will then perhaps take some kind of action. And that doesn't have to be some bold, suddenly, work for USAID or Mother Teresa, whatever. It can be a gentle, small act of kindness or caring. So I think that would be my answer.
On the first part, I am coming off of a year where we have fostered 2 kids. We have 3 of our own biological kids, and we're fostering 2 kids. So I found your book not motivating. Apologize. I found it very meaningful to me. I want to say that first and foremost. But it was because I felt that sense of overwhelming, like that sense of overwhelm that comes through. That's the way that I felt, and so I think my tank was overflowing. I had too much going on, and so I could see, like, I think that your work succeeds. I think it would succeed in motivating most people. I think for me, it was a lot going on right then, and instead, what I found was a sense of was a balm for me, and so I want to say thank you for that. And I would definitely want to say that you succeed in that sense of maybe that sense of belonging, but that sense of togetherness. That you do an excellent job of making the person feel what you're feeling, and so I definitely think you succeed. And so I don't know if that I'm just one random dude, but like hopefully that means something.
I will say, for me, creative writing and poetry have this incredible ability to bring to life this sort of subterranean landscape of subtlety that exists underneath conventional wisdom and sort of cheap language. And I do believe that to me, it's just so refreshing. It's like coming home to the true subtlety and complexity of the world when we all, for the most part, live on sort of cheap, generic, stereotypical, conventional wisdom a lot of the time. And so poetry has this way of kind of saying, oh, okay, well, this I know what this person's talking about. It's just, it wasn't necessarily spoken of, in CNN news, but it's a reality nonetheless that needs evoking. And poetry has the ability to do that. And for me, it's kind of like a validation that the world, it is tremendously nuanced. It's not black and white. And we need to inhabit that place of grayness and subtlety much more than we do.
And that comes in your writing with, I mentioned the overwhelm, and you talk a lot about handling the overwhelm with kind of, there's a constant acknowledgement of impermanence and of meeting this overwhelm with fluidity. Can you speak to that a little bit about meeting? Sometimes we say subtlety, and I know that partly what you mean too is like the torrent when it's just so much going on that you can't. The subtlety is the inexhaustible expression. Like you can't. You talk about chemo. You talk about your father's passing. You talk about all the horrors that you've seen, and your child in the midst of it. I mean, these are not things that, as well as you capture them, they are not fully captured. Can you speak to kind of that response that you give us throughout of embracing the moment and your fluidity?
what was most important to me when I was in college, I took a class from this man named Robert Thurman, who's, was one of the key people bringing Tibetan Buddhism to the West. And it kind of hit me. I feel like I took one of his classes and my life was changed forever. Just this Buddhist idea of there is nothing innately permanent in anything, and everything is profoundly interconnected. There's nothing with any inherent solidity to it. And I think that's something very easy to say, but very hard to viscerally understand, especially in a culture like ours that is based on individualism and the core solid self, the Marlboro man who is full of strong character. And we cherish, defending our boundaries and maintaining. We have so much of pop psychology is about this importance of keeping your boundaries up and being healthy in that way. And I think for American individualists, it's a very hard thing to viscerally feel and accept. And yet I do think it is ultimately the best kind of medicine for us. I really do. This letting go, this seeing of suffering not as, for example, I've always been struck by Tibetan Buddhists and the ways in which they conceptualize suffering. And for them, for many of the lay men and women, there is a sense that their suffering is not individuated and unique. It is something that everyone shares, and it's automatically linked up to a kind of compassion for the rest of the suffering world. And I just think too often American individualists get locked in a very isolated, lonely, alienated place that champions solid boundaries, core personality traits, and the durability of things. And I think that can lead to a tremendous amount of isolation that can be really brutal as a human to endure. I really believe that.
Well, I mean, that's what we see, a whole collection of culturally specific problems that seem to attend mental health in the West, right? So I don't think anyone, you may disagree about the causes, but no one can disagree that they're there. This actually leads me to like the next question I was going to ask. Can you talk a little bit more about, in my own mind, it was like the addiction to explanation. This was actually something that I found personally really helpful, because as I was working with the two foster kids, I was constantly trying to explain all the new behaviors that cropped up, and it was exhausting. I was spending so much time trying to figure it out. And a lot of times we fixed it before I could figure out what was going on. And then I read your book and I was like, I could have saved myself a lot of trouble if I stopped trying to figure this out. And I just was here and I was just loving them and I was just present. Can you talk a little bit about, and it's not a binary, but it's definitely, as you talk about, kind of this antidote from Buddhism to like Freud, for example, like he gets, I think he gets mentioned at least once, I think a couple times, right? Can you talk a little bit about our addiction to explanation and maybe its strengths, but clearly its weaknesses?
Well, I think it's something. So a lot of my book, I talk about the human need to come up with stories about what humans are going through, and especially stories around suffering. Um, so, cross-culturally, there are many different ways they're called idioms of distress. So many different stories we use to come up to explain what is happening to us at any given moment. Why are we suffering? And I think, again, the mind tends to root around constantly and reach out for some kind of story to explain, why are my kids behaving this way, etc. And I think what we do is we reach out to stories that are culturally approved, and stories that are either in vogue now or get a lot of press, or they're approved in the sense that they have some of our core assumptions backing them. It could be, you root around for a story that's biomedical, because that, frankly, is something that is percolating always in this American culture, right? But I do think there really is a danger in sticking to fixed narratives of things. I think there's something to be said for having flexibility and multiple perspectives at any given point of, why do I feel this way today? Why are my kids behaving this way today? I think it involves a letting go and an acknowledgement that there is no one story ever. There's multiple stories and perspectives at any given moment. And that can be tremendously dizzying sometimes and overwhelming, but it can also be incredibly liberating, because you realize, okay, I don't have to espouse just this one story. I can also think of something in a different way. So I think, again, the explanations you're talking about, I think we can get a little too hooked into any one given explanation, and we don't always realize that it's culturally constructed, and that it might be there because most of the corporate powers want it there. So buying into certain stories might not be in your best interest. I think it's interesting to have a level of agility and flexibility, and to realize in a nice humble way that you're not always tapping into some grand truth. You're tapping into one little culture's version of reality that is historical and changes and will change in 20 years. And it's what's on the ground right now. So I would say, that level of flexibility is a good thing.
Yeah, I that's something I really appreciate. I think it's why part of the reason your book resonated with me is that part of the Chasing Leviathan, it comes from Job 28, that you can never catch Leviathan, so that the truth is worth pursuing, but you never catch it.
Yes.
And this idea of like, we have many stories, and yes, they do all exist together, but whatever it is that contains all those stories, it's bigger than you.
Yes. Yeah.
And so this feeling of like, well, I got to find the story that includes everyone else's stories under, like I can fit it, I can compact it, and letting go of that, because you're not that smart. No human is. Like, no one has that capacity. And I think that's a wonderful thing. I think that's a very powerful thing. I wanted to ask you a little bit more too about, you've talked about, we desire these stories that are culturally approved. Can you talk about when you first work with these foreign, sometimes it's over in their country, sometimes it's over here after they immigrate, but they often start their stories collectively. Can you talk about what you have observed in that difference between when they start with my people or the land?
Mhm. I think, again, we are so absorbed in our own culture's stories, we don't even see them as American stories. And again, American stories tend to be we like a heroic kind of I-centered story. We don't often open our stories with in the beginning creation or the cosmos or, the land or larger domains. It tends to be very much from the unique perspective of the psychologized self. And I guess for me, what I've been so struck by is how refugees that I have worked with for over 2 decades now, they have their own stories, which are often much more collective. And I think anthropologists often refer to this term as sociocentric, basing the self in the tribe, in land, in gods, something larger than the physical, unique body of the self of the individual. So they come here and immediately they get socialized into needing to tell a story from this I perspective. For example, I'll give you one example. I was helping to teach a creative writing class to refugees here. And another woman who was helping teach it with me said, let's do introductions. And all of the refugees went around and they raised their hand and they said, I'm Congo or I'm South Sudan. And she said, no, what's your real name? And she also kind of implied that that wasn't good, that they needed to get in touch. They were living somewhat of an illusion. They needed to get in touch with the real I, which was this highly unique, no one else in the world is like you, I. So they, very proudly raised their hands, and she was like, no, we want your real name. And I think asylum seekers, when they come here and they have to give an asylum story, very quickly learn that you don't start out with, in the beginning, there was creation. You go for the very, in some ways, self-assertive story of, this is what happened to me. I pushed back. I'm conquering, and I am somewhat of a hero, and I am unique in this journey. So I do think we have these stories that refugees get socialized into. And what I find in some ways is really interesting is that refugees, they want to be part of communities. They want to speak our language. They want to be enfolded into American culture. And part of that involves taking up our stories. And so I definitely have seen refugees literally practicing things like, how to pronounce the word stress, because it's such an...
I was going to ask you about that story. Was astonishing to hear. Like, I have the stresses. Sorry. Sorry, go ahead.
No, it's just very, not only that, I think what's fascinating is that not all stories, we have a hierarchy of what constitutes the best story. So, for example, in one of my pieces in the book, it's called On the Brilliance of Your Story, and it's about a Burmese refugee who basically has this very healing narrative based in becoming a Jehovah's Witness. And that's their story, that heals and explains and encompasses their suffering. And they get here and they're told they're in denial, they're repressing, and that the real story is PTSD, serotonin, deficits, biomedical PTSD, or kind of a psychologized version of I have anxiety, etc. So that's what I find hard is sometimes they come with these beautiful stories that are healing them and holding them in the universe in a kind of way that is helping them. And yet I think in many ways we kind of ethnocentrically say, no, you've got to adopt the psychologized, individualized American story. And it's not always in their best interest, I don't think. So, yeah. So that's a piece on the brilliance of your story. And if you want, I can read it. I don't think it's too long.
I mean, I'd be happy to. Yeah. I also want to leave enough so that people have to, buy the book and read it. But if you want to read an excerpt, go for it. Yeah.
Okay, I'll read this. On the brilliance of your story. And it starts out with a term that is actually a real term that some of the social workers working with this refugee used, called psychophobia, which I'd never heard of, but apparently is an aversion to psychological considerations. So they felt that this refugee had psychophobia because they weren't adopting the psychologized view of self. So this is called On the Brilliance of Your Story. Your fingers still bruise your rosary with mad devotion. When you first came to America, your loneliness swelling high above the bus station, up where the angels lay, you built your makeshift apocalyptic nest, pulling in the cheapest Jersey gods that flew around, storm after storm in that neon grim city. Now you are losing it, they say, paranoid delusions of soldiers breaking into your house. You hide your car from the police, clutching the hot vein of your cell phone as you drive your mother in her conical straw hat across the bumpy Vermont fields, staring out from her yolky Alzheimer's haze as the car lurches over the mud and leaves. I tell them to let you be, let you suckle on the story that heals, even if it's one they don't approve. No one can weave as fiercely as you who never should have been exiled from Burma, you afraid to leave your apartment now, the isolation you say now suits you. Once you recalled for them the steamy jungles of your birth, the hell of your flight, where you ran and ran through the night and woke to a python wrapped around a tree, your father hacking its head off, prying its 17-foot-long body off the trunk. It took so long for it to die, to uncoil enough so you could feast on the eggs lined up like potatoes in its womb. Now you want to speak of Jesus's paradise, and the white coats look at you and speak to you of maintaining healthy boundaries. Though you tell them you are well, that reincarnation landed you with Jesus, they say you are in denial, a form of death, a blindness, talk to you of the dangers of psychophobia, show you a cartoon called My Ego. What you really want to speak of is angels, the Holy Spirit, golden wings, dappled light, the latest issue of the Watchtower. For now, who is to say what stories suffocate or heal, which ones work or fall flat, which ones comfort us in the dark? The X-rays of your brain with their gullies and black caves may or may not save you. The stories they hurl to you for rescue can still let whole vats of plump suffering slide through their nets as the white coats proudly drag you onto shore. Oh, the brilliance of your story, they say, is covering up the real story. Don't let them belittle it. as you coax yourself home each night with the angels that calm you, who is to say what holds you intact as you're hurled through space, landing with a thump into the great American refugee hive, and begin this frantic human work, perpetual manic revival, stretching your way through the half-light of this vast, unraveling strangeness. So the hierarchy of stories and what ones are allowed and seen as legit in the healing process is very interesting.
Yeah. Oh, very interesting. And what we understand even from a medical perspective that what we are working with are models. We don't, like, most people don't fully understand what's going on with their body.
Mm-hmm.
But if we understand the story of the model, which isn't accurate either,
Mm-hmm.
somehow that's still better than this religious thing that she has clasped
Yeah.
onto, right? And
Yeah.
it's neither of them is actually really accurate, but one of them is culturally approved.
Yeah.
Am I tracking with
Yeah.
you there? Is that?
I think also a lot of refugees, they talk of somatic stories much more than we do. Stories of that are based in the body, and oftentimes, I must say, I would go to the hospital with certain refugees who would present somatically. They would present with paralysis of half of their body, for example. And the doctors would basically say that person who was presenting somatically had conversion disorder, meaning they had failed to convert the soma, the body, into some kind of psychological suffering, which is very ethnocentric in a way, as if in order to suffer, you have to suffer psychologically. It cannot be somatically. This one.
Very dualistic.
Yeah. I think.
Sorry, go
Well,
ahead.
this one woman I worked with, she had bodily paralysis after her mother died. And the doctors were quite frustrated and actually, I think, felt a little sorry for her, as if she was behind in the whole mental health literacy scheme, where if you're healthy, you present psychologically as anxiety. And yet she was not anxious. She wasn't depressed. Half her body was paralyzed, and her interpretation of it was that, it was just a bodily fluke. And so they were like, well, she's in denial. I don't know. Who's to say that distress should always be presented psychologically?
It's a very complex system interweaving between the two of them, and to say that causality always starts here or there, it's I forgive it. I really cannot tell you how much I appreciate this book. I actually was in the hospital with stress earlier, like in December.
Really?
And the left side of my face was like, I was reading it and I was like, and they could not figure it out. And they were finally like, well, you're okay. And you just get bothered sometimes. Mm-hmm. Like they gave me like and I was like reading this and I was like, and I was really worried. Yeah. I was really worried because I didn't have a reason for it to happen. Yeah. And I read, like, I'm sorry, like, I know this is very personal, but literally I was reading the book and I was like, most of the problems I'm facing are because I'm worried about this. Yeah. And then like that has gone away. I stopped worrying about it and it's not been a big deal. And it's so, yeah. I mean, like to this day, the doctors are like, we don't know how to help you. Yeah. That's what I got. And I not to say that it doesn't, you can't find ways for these other stories to work, like the American story, but like sometimes they don't. And if you can feel very isolated if you feel the need to make your story fit.
Yes. Yeah. Yeah, I think it's amazing. One of the things, I teach a class on anthropology of mental health. And one of the things that the students hopefully end up getting from the class is a real sense that the stories we tell about our suffering end up impacting that suffering itself. So
Yes.
if we view, the feeling, the tightness in our chest as DSM 4.60 acute anxiety disorder, that tends to locate us as sort of problematic, isolated, screwed up, failures. If you were to think of that as, human stress level 1, then you're automatically labeled as this is what suffering is an innate part of life. And it's just what it means to be human. And you're experiencing level 1 and you are still part of the human race. That's a very different way to view the tightness in your chest than, oh my God, I'm a freak. I have this chronic disorder that only this % of people get, and I'll be on meds the rest of my life and blah, blah, blah. Which one do you think is going to help you deal with that tightness in your chest and move on? And which one will aggravate it? It's pretty interesting. I mean, schizophrenia does worse in Western cultures. Despite all of our medications, it does worse. It's the stories we tell around schizophrenia are not ones that are very conducive to recovery.
Yeah. Very stigmatizing.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So, and if you're not comfortable with this question, I'm okay to skip it. But I had to ask, because I laughed out loud. And so I guess I'm asking if this was intended to be funny or if I just have a sick sense of humor. Did you intend for, when you were writing about the minefields in Sudan, and then you compared it to your students in Vermont with like, was that intended to be funny? Like them being woke and the whole minefield of talking?
Yeah, it was intended. Yeah, it was supposed to be funny, but it's also true.
Yes.
Yeah.
That's often the best kind of funny.
Yeah. I mean, I guess a colleague of mine just sent me an article called The Anxious Generation. Another one sent me an article, The Coddling of the American Undergrad. I think what's spreading like wildfire across the globe, but also across America, is this idea of the self as profoundly fragile and delicate and very triggerable. And I think it's a really dangerous conception of self to have rule our country right now. I did some research among upper middle class parents a long time ago in Manhattan, and the most common metaphor they gave for their children was that they were flowers. And the implication was it took great amounts of effort to give them the right amounts of light and shade and water, and you could destroy them if you stepped on them the wrong way. They're very delicate. And I think that I really do see that in a lot of undergrads right now, that sense of tremendous fragility and that sense of I could be triggered at any moment and that could be a horrible thing, or I could trigger someone else. I gave my students a PTSD questionnaire that I had also given some of the young girls who are South Sudanese refugees who we support, an NGO I helped co-found, who we help support in Uganda. And the students in my class scored higher on the levels of PTSD. And so there's a piece in my book about that, which is, it's just, I do think, right now, trauma is America's favorite diagnosis, and it's something that so many of our novels and fiction are based around, and trauma-informed everything is roaming across the landscape of churches, of schools, of yoga, of you name it. It's very, very, very common now. And I'm not saying people aren't suffering, but I do think how we conceptualize trauma, there are some assumptions, that about how you deal with trauma that might not necessarily always be in our best interest. The idea that we always need talk therapy with someone we don't know in a private room. We need exposure. The idea that feelings always have to come out or you'll get sick, like this Freudian hydraulic metaphor that if you keep them down, that's really bad. These are assumptions that they're not believed by all people in the world or practiced, and yet we think it's the truth. I think there's this real emphasis on repeating, like getting to know your exact trauma story and revisiting it over and over again. And that is
rehearsing it.
Yeah. Yep. And I think there's also people end up competing on college campuses, who has more suffering.
Which is a weird thing to compete for. Yeah. Sorry, go ahead.
No, I just think that some of the ways we have decided you treat trauma are not always acknowledged as just one culture's way of viewing healing of distress or suffering. So yeah, I do think we are also exporting our ideas about trauma to other cultures around the globe. It's fascinating that to a lot of war zones, the first thing we ship over are therapists and not food. We ship over metaphors of the self. Like one of the things that I'm fascinated by is pharmaceutical companies will hire anthropologists to look at what metaphors might work in a particular culture. So when they wanted to market, I think it was Paxil in Japan, they needed to come up with a metaphor for the self that would make Japanese want to take Paxil. And so I think they called it a common cold of the soul. And pharmaceutical companies have done that in other cultures as well. And sometimes they'll think that a certain metaphor will work, like the broken brain serotonin depletion one. And what is interesting is that doesn't always help. A lot of people end up thinking, oh, okay, I have a broken brain now and I'll never get better. Whereas the metaphors they were using before to explain their schizophrenia or whatever were not as damning or as permanent. And so they had this more of a sense of hope, or more of a sense that what they were going through was something that a lot of other people experienced as well. So I do think we're globalizing metaphors for self and American ways of American views on trauma and suffering that we think the whole world should take up.
if we, I just want to make sure I'm tracking with you here. Kind of what I'm hearing is if we make these stories of trauma and the self fundamental, a lot of times what we end up doing is we make fragility fundamental. Is that like, I, Dr. Kusserow, I do want to say, I want to be respectful of your time. If I could ask you one last question.
Yeah.
For our audience, a lot of great things you shared today, and I've really appreciated it. As I said multiple times. What is one thing you'd ask that they think about as they go throughout the week? What is one thing that you'd want them to think on or kind of chew on as they go throughout the week after listening to this episode?
I guess it would be a couple things to become more, to use the word mindful, the most common word, to become more mindful of the stories they are telling themselves around their own suffering, to ask themselves, okay, this is interesting. What am I telling myself about why I'm suffering? And to notice what are the stories they're telling themselves, and to perhaps try a couple other stories, to realize that the stories they're telling themselves might not be the only stories they could tell themselves. And what the heck, maybe try on another story. Like, I've been doing this with my students in my anthropology class. And it might seem a little bizarre, but I have them reading this book on Tibetan Buddhist versions of suffering, and I have them apply those concepts to their own anxiety, which is often what they complain of and talk about. So I have them move from, say, biomedical versions of anxiety to this is a disorder, etc., to perhaps saying to themselves, through this anxiety, I am also connecting with all the other people in the world who are experiencing anxiety, and it is developing more compassion in myself because of this. I try and have them move from the story of what's wrong with me, I'm suffering, I should be, sort of perky, Prozac-y and happy all the time. I have them think, well, what if suffering is a core component of human life and I'm not a failure because I'm suffering? So, just two things: examine and become aware of the stories they're telling themselves about suffering, and just try on maybe a little different angle or different story and see how it feels and see what it does to their own suffering.
One, tremendous answer, a great answer, and definitely something that I love that we take away from this. I am still enjoying Perky and Prozac. I will definitely steal that. Dr. Kusserow, it has been an absolute joy having you on today. Thank you. I appreciate it.
You're welcome. You're welcome. Thank you so much.